Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first of a three-part series on the history of zero trust. My name is James Tucker, the head of CISO for EMEA, and I'm joined here in the heart of central London by Martyn Ditchburn.
Hey, James, it's great to be here. So Martyn Ditchburn, CTO in residence for Zscaler in the EMEA region. I've worked here for about 3 years, and I think the important thing about my role is that I was a former customer. So I've very much lived and breathe the real life sort of zero trust journey, but also the other technology strategies that kind of go along with running real world businesses and embracing new markets and geographies.
That's good. I'm hoping you'll balance me out since I've been in vendor space my entire life, and you can tell me where I've been drinking the Kool-Aid a little bit.
I will definitely tell you.
Keep me honest and slap me about the head and neck, right?
All right.
So the first episode here, we're going to be talking about the history of zero trust and why zero trust is a thing. I think anybody who is listening to this will quite obviously have seen zero trust probably, 8,000 times in the past week. And I see when I'm talking to people that there's a perception that it's been taken over by marketing in some ways. And what's important to me is that we start this by really establishing what zero trust is and why it's important. What do you think?
Yeah, I think zero trust has become that buzzword. Certainly when I was looking to implement sort of my technology journey in my last organization, we didn't set out with a zero trust agenda in mind. We were very much looking to solve real world business challenges. And for us, that was all about scaling the organization, embracing new markets and geographies like we never had before, reducing that friction from our end user population, and ultimately helping the business succeed and grow. So I guess that's where a lot of our customers find themselves, right? Those organizations aren't technology companies for the most part. So it is about how you operate your business and how you, push into those.
It's about the outcomes and not,
right.
Hey, I'd like to buy one zero trust.
Yes.
All right. So, I'm a bit of a history nerd, and I know you've heard me say this before, but I'll start a little strong. I think the fundamental problem in modern networking is that the internet was created by hippies, right? And I know you'll call me out on that because it's a little bit of a strong statement. But really, if there's kind of the internet laws, right? And the one that I'm thinking about in this case is Conway's law. I'll simplify it for the purposes of the podcast, but basically the things that an organization creates represents the ideals and ethos of the people who are of that organization. So with that, I think the internet, the protocols and all of those kind of things were created with a lot of openness and that kind of open anti-establishment, right? I like to say free love out there on the internet. I know you've pulled me up on that a few times. What do you think?
I think it would be fair to say that the internet embodies and reflects the culture at the time. So that idea of free sharing and kind of distributed knowledge makes perfect sense. I think we can all agree that as a technology, it was created by some very smart people. And in fact, some of those smart people also become some of the first hackers. So the very thing that they created, they embodied the first of, the need for a security generation, but probably without knowing to do it. It was all about sharing and seeing if you could do one over on your tech sort of friends and your sort of colleagues, being those sort of nerds.
Bragging rights.
Yeah, that's right. In the garage, in the nerd. And in fact, I think Bill Gates was one of the first, publicly recognized sort of hackers or reformed hackers. And of course, he went on to embrace Microsoft.
He did Microsoft. Mm-hmm. Interesting. So where that, I think the origin of this gets complicated, and I'm working towards ARPANET, which I think is sort of the Proto Internet, if you will. And that was the concept of trust within that was really implicit on who you were. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, the idea of the internet was reaching out to your buddy, at the time, and maybe sort of exchanging some information, maybe sending them a message. And it was very much a push-pull kind of relationship. And I think as we look at that in the business context, the same thing started to happen. Organizations were paper-driven. And of course, as those businesses expanded outside of, a single office to multiple offices, that need to push and pull and exchange information became a thing. So we sort of had this interesting parallel between the internet and the ARPANET as, the life it kind of started with, to something that was much more private. So you sort of had groups of your buddies, in the outside world, which we now know as the internet.
Different universities that are all interconnected.
That's right. And then you had groups of your buddies, which were really colleagues that you worked with. So it was all really about sort of frictionless communication with, people you knew. But that's obviously not the world we're in now, right? Now we collaborate with people we don't know.
And at the time, I've seen some images online where everybody who is connected to the internet, which you could draw on the back of a single A4 piece of paper, was a known person, right? Their identity was confirmed. You know which university or government institution they were at. You knew their name and email address. And there was pictures of phone books out there, like email phone books, which I think is the compensating control at the time for the identity problem that I think we're working towards here, which is I could tell that, Bob Smith at wherever university and send him an email. But now with, how many bajillion people are on the internet today, I think that that phone book would be, do they even make phone books anymore?
I don't think they do. I think probably wouldn't be enough trees in the world for everything now.
What do people squish spiders with these days?
I used to use the phone book to stand on top to reach the top shelf. So that was kind of my thing towards the end.
We've talked a little bit about that kind of the openness and Conway's law and the fundamental protocols that were created in that with that ethos. And those are great. A lot of the amazing things about the internet, I think, today are based on that. I think in you and I's daily life, though, it's kind of been kicking us in the backside for, 30 years?
Right.
Because those fundamental problems of
sharing and getting things out there and people being able to talk to you.
Just implicit trust,
right.
I think, becomes a bit of a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
So let's kind of move forward, and I think a little bit. And I think where the big problems started to come around is when we started taking credit card numbers on the internet, right? And then there was money. Now there's an incentive for smart hackers or people who with sufficient set of skills to go out there and try to figure out ways to earn a quick buck, right? At the time, it was rate limited because, you had to connect your modem and do all that stuff.
Do you remember those funky noises that they used to get with the dial-up?
I'm not going to do it on the podcast, but I'm pretty sure I could do a reasonable facsimile of a 56K modem connect. Then I think we start seeing more firewalls and more real security technology, because this was being used as, a real tool to get real business. And, the Proto Internet had become the first baby steps into what we see now. So from your perspective, when it comes to, how that impacted the view of security and the kind of things we did during that time period, what would you say the kind of checks and balances, how was security designed around that?
Yeah, I think to answer that question, we sort of have to look a little bit further back, to the point of the hybrid world, which was the paper world plus kind of the digital kind of world. So if you think about an organization, they would probably have some back-end admin processes. To your point, there would be some sort of money exchange as part of that, probably sort of checks, back in the day, but obviously moving into credit cards. And that used to reside solely within the organization. There used to be some sort of telemarketer that would take that information, or it would be faxed in. Some interesting stories about sort of faxes and how that emerged. But ultimately, that information suddenly started to leave the organization. Why? Because those organizations were expanding their operations. They were having more than one office. Consumers were choosing to buy in a different way they had before. It used to be a very physical transaction. So the idea that information was both coming in but also going out of the organization was something that started to kind of emerge as what we now know as the PCI sort of problem.
And for me, as an old network kind of security guy, we solved this problem in a really easy way. We had kind of 2 ports on our firewall. This was the trusted network, and this was everyone else, right? And what you're talking about in terms of that kind of lateral spread, creating connections between offices and having that sort of entire largely unchecked network here, right, was really, and still is in a lot of organizations today, ripe pickings for anybody who manages to get past that kind of single doorman in the firewall.
Yeah, I think that idea of the hard shell, kind of soft center, is something that really did come from that time of, if we were in an organization, we knew everybody that worked there, right? It was probably a single office. We hopefully trusted those people. So really kind of the networking extended out that idea of, you're my buddy. We work together all the time, therefore I trust you. But if I have someone outside my organization, well, I don't know them so well, right? That fight or flight type thinking sort of kicks in. And because of that, my brain is saying that individual, is questionable, which kind of means that if we have this wall in between us, we've been building walls for hundreds of years, right? The idea of castle and moat, we talk about that in the zero trust kind of world, comes from that old idea of protection, right? We used to have something we loved and we would build a wall around it and hopefully kind of keep it safe. And then for, hundreds of years after that, people try and breach the wall.
I'm glad that we've moved away from the fruit-based analogies, the coconut, the avocado, the watermelon, and all those, and into the castle and moat. And the reason we stopped building castles and moats in the real world is because, today I could just send drones over or aircraft or any of that. Technology has moved beyond that kind of paradigm for security, right? But still, I think it's the fundamental starting point for security is this is my stuff, right? How does that work? And I guess we'll dig deeper into this into episode 2, but how does that work, that mentality work in a modern environment?
Yeah, they are in conflict, right? The idea that there is something that you used to have in a static place and you used to know exactly where it was and you knew who had access and you knew the times of days that they'd have access. Well, of course, the modern world isn't.
Did you know, though?
You did know. Yeah, you did know. They were your buddies, like we were saying. They were your buddies in your office. Generally, people had hopefully a good work-life balance, right? So there would be a 9-to-5 type operation. Things were predictable. But as we started to expand our operations globally, all those things that we used to rely on as trusted, metrics or identifiers for that individual, they start to change. So operating hours change, users start to change locations, and those are the factors that security used to sort of rely on. So to your point, the walls just aren't effective anymore because those elements that we used to rely on have now moved outside the wall. So yeah, they're a constant challenge, and one of the biggest challenges we continue to face today is that networking has changed a lot over the last 30 plus years. But there are a lot of people who think the same way, from 30 years back, right? Because that's how they started their IT career.
I'd say there's also a lot of people who have been sort of waving this flag and trying to say, hey, guys, I'm tired of spending my Fridays cleaning up some sort of incident. Thinking back to like the Jericho Forum and the set of rules that they put out, which for me, I think are fundamentally the basis on what a lot of modern zero trust mindset is built on. And then we start seeing, a lot of the other big players here, NIST and, Forrester and Gartner start talking about, hey, I think this zero trust thing makes sense. And fundamentally, could you compare a little bit of the old school mindset, the castle and moat mindset, with what's fundamentally different with it, with the zero trust concepts? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think taking those ideas that you used to know your buddy and communicate with your buddy, they were everybody that we trusted, and of course, everybody outside of that context were the people that we didn't trust. And I think as we move into this world where, data is kind of everywhere, people are more mobile, we need to find a way to evaluate the same conditions, trusted versus untrusted. So the easiest way to do that is just to simplify. So we talk a lot about removing complexity in the zero trust world. And really the simplest way you can deal with it is by treating everybody as untrusted. That idea that every data point is evaluated, and you have a series of controls that can decide how to enforce those data points as, the organization decides what posture it wants, who they want access, the things they want access to. But that's a very different world to the way that, the castle and moat piece kind of evolved. So when you think about the old castle and moat, you'd have probably one entry point to your sort of castle. You'd be evaluated and you'd walk in the door. And that's a very real world parallel to VPNs today, right? There is a front door.
Don't get me started on VPNs. I know. This will be a 12-part series in this podcast.
Yeah. And I think, you as CISOs, you very commonly say, if you can reach it, you can breach it. Well, that's exactly what a front door is. It's advertised, you know where to go, and there might be an inspection point there. But beyond that, the number of checks and balances get far fewer. Well, Zero Trust completely changes that. So there is a check and balance for every element along your journey. And in fact, you don't even need to know where you're going in the Zero Trust world.
They're coming for you, Martyn.
Yeah, they are coming. I know.
So you were talking about fundamentally the difference between the castle and moat type security and Zero Trust. We talked a lot about the kind of problems, which is the implicit trust that we had meant that we just said, hey, when you're inside, do whatever you want, right? It's you've probably, I mean, I'm getting kind of old, so maybe not in 20 years, but I used to go to the bars where you had to put on the nice shoes, no flip flops, and then as soon as you get in, doesn't really matter. It's a punk rock show.
Right.
Everything's chaos inside, and I think that is what a lot of modern networks, especially during the time period we're talking about as well. But that's the idea, which is, I don't care as long as you are identified as one of us. Mm-hmm. But I mean, we see it all the time when we're talking about credential theft, identity theft, both in our personal lives and in public life as well. Because if I can steal your credentials and log in as you, I have access to the entire keys to the kingdom.
Right. And I think you've got to remember where the concept of credentials came from, right? Going back to that paper world, there was somewhere you stored paper, right? It had a lock on the door. And at some point you would share around the keys and, that wasn't great. So what did they do? They digitized that content. Well, the first generation of protection for data was a password. And those passwords were shared, which then meant that one password wasn't enough. You had to have many passwords. So individuals, the idea of identity started to evolve. So really that concept of Zero Trust has been based on something that we've had for decades, which was a physical medium that's turned to something a bit more digital. And we've really answered the problem of a digital solution in the way that we used to answer something that had a physical kind of solution.
And that makes sense. So we see this in cloud transformations where they just sort of lift these things and shift it and don't take advantage of any of the benefits of cloud scale. Don't even think about things like Docker and all that stuff. That's just servers now here, moving the problem, as I call it. So to move that a little bit farther along, like when it comes to the fundamental problem that Zero Trust is trying to address is one of too much trust. And, things that we say all the time, which is never trust and always verify, right? Because I know that you're a great dude, love hanging out with you, looking forward to a pint later, all that stuff. But I'm not sure it's you or, three toddlers in a trench coat that identify as Martyn. I need to know that. And so identity has become in a lot of ways this thing that we didn't have an identity. We just had a password on the back of the keyboard on a yellow stickum, right? And now it is fundamentally how I understand who you are in context of access to all these applications. And that is the perimeter of my environment. Do you agree?
I do. And I think, you mentioned the little sticky notes. We've all seen those, over the years.
I still have one.
Strangely enough, there is a trail of thought that helps you believe that using a password on a sticky is now potentially more secure than having your passwords in a digital medium, because those digital mediums can now be copied and distributed. So there's kind of an interesting trail of thought of how going backwards in time and
there's a couple of ways to handle that.
Right.
Have you been in a hotel recently and gotten the Wi-Fi like hotel 2021 or 2019 recently?
Yeah, it's always the room number followed by something, right? So it's easy to guess.
I see a lot of year-based passwords,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm like, well, at what point does that password become secure again? Because nobody's going to try the past 5 years.
Right. And if everybody has it, it's not really secure, right? It's the
Fair enough.
right. So I think as we approach this idea of kind of what zero trust does is that simplification, right? So the idea of removing that friction from humans, because as we know, right, as human beings, we want things to be as simple as possible. And if it isn't, well, guess what? We're going to find a way around it, right? We only have to look as far as AI to kind of get back to that human condition of frictionless kind of sharing of information. Any barrier to people doing their jobs is going to create, I guess, a resistance to the way security needs to operate, which is to protect the organization. So that evolution of zero trust with the view of simplifying the human experience and those users is really sort of core to the success. So as well as the architecture being fundamentally different than castle and moat, the idea that I need something and I'm establishing it at that point of need, and it is being evaluated on a number of criteria before I can even get there.
Can we spend a few minutes talking about the fundamental difference in architecture there? Mm-hmm. Hopefully most of the listeners or viewers here will have this, but I'm a CISO. I don't understand this complicated network stuff. So, give me the fundamental differences between that kind of castle and moat. Like, how does it differ for me as a user, or, what can I do and can't do versus the zero trust architecture? And how does that solve the fundamental problem of too much trust?
So I think what it boils down to is the 3 A's. So access, authentication, and accountability. And really, most network solutions, in fact, all network solutions that I could think of for the last 30 years have started with access. The idea there is a device that it reaches out and it says, hey, can I have an address on your network? Or, hey, can I please get access to your VPN? It all starts with access. And I guess that kind of every A after that, or every security protocol after that, is trying to remove and reduce the thing that we've done as step number 1, which is grant access. So zero trust, ultimately, it removes that first A and puts it right at the back. So the first thing it will do is authenticate and evaluate that condition of, are you who you say you are? Should you get access to something? Accountability, in cloud-based scale is tremendously helpful to any security organization. The idea of logging every transaction is a huge improvement from where we used to be. Firewalls were normally sort of limited on the things that they could store. So really, zero trust and the cloud is synonymous with each other in terms of its architecture. But only once those things have been verified and inspected can you then allow that access. And that's really the fundamental difference with zero trust. We're taking that first A and we're putting it to the back.
So let's go ahead and summarize what we've been talking about for the past 20 minutes or so. The internet was created with the spirit of openness and freedom of information. And there was an implicit trust to that. That was a little complicated by the needs of ARPANET and the Department of Defense, because they needed it to be highly reliant. And what that resulted in was a network that was very good at sharing information, very resilient, and trusted pretty much anyone with a RJ45 connection. I guess it was RJ11 at the time. And so then we start moving into areas where businesses are bringing their products on the web at the time. More computers were out in the houses. And now the internet, it's no longer possible to control who's connected to it. Everybody has access, and there's no real way to verify who's who. And then we start seeing the first identity fraud. And this fundamental trust aspect, we started solving it in the in our world by saying, hey, here's my firewall. Everybody on this side is trusted. Everybody on the other side, we're untrusted. But the fundamental issue of trust still existed inside our environments. And now, where we see a more modern environment, a more modern environment doesn't have any sort of borders anyway. So really, that barrier of this is us and that is them has been broken down. And for me, that is the real need for zero trust, is because we can't trust anybody.
Yes, so you're right. So the modern world has kind of disbanded those original sort of sharing ideas, and it's made it much more complex. So applying those old-fashioned ways of securing our data in the ways that we used to sort of 20 years ago isn't applicable today. Why? Because people are choosing to work in different locations. That data is moving outside those walls that we talked about. They're choosing to do business on a number of devices. So I think I have at least 3 with me today. The idea that I am shifting between my mobile sort of laptops and my sort of tablets and maybe my phones is really complicating things for the security teams.
You probably go through 20 to 50 IP addresses a day.
Right.
And I do want to add one important note here, because I was giving a similar talk a couple of weeks ago, and one of the members of the Tor project was presenting there. And it's really important to point out that zero trust is not something that should be applied to the entire internet, right? When we're talking about this, it's specifically within the confines of corporate data and not when it comes to open access to the public internet, right? I do think that you need to be able to not be identified on the public internet. You see a lot of things with, political dissidents and that kind of stuff. And that is fundamental to what the internet is and the value that the internet can provide. I mean, that also has a downside. I don't know if you've seen Twitter, but it's really important for me to say that, that is core to the value of the internet itself. And really, when we're talking about zero trust, it's in context of how do we protect our corporate data and the company's data that we're working with. So, the people who are using our services out there on the internet, don't have their identity or their data splayed across, whatever Pastebin or some random internet website.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that's changed. We've moved from that physical medium to something that's digital. And of course, we've talked about business data quite a lot. But now we have digital personas of our own, and that is worth protecting as important as, the companies that we work for.
All right. So I think we've sort of talked a lot about the history of zero trust and made a case for why we think this is important. In the next episode, let's go ahead and talk about what zero trust looks like today and how companies are either being successful or probably, and I'm looking to you for some practical examples here, how they're struggling to actually implement this in a meaningful way. So thank you so much for this conversation, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, James. It was great to speak to you today.
Cheers, Martyn.